All right, AP World. I'm going to crank out two videos here. First one's going to take us through the World War II years. This is going to be for any of you who miss any class notes and just need to get yourself caught up. And then the second one is going to deal with atrocities of the 20th century to finish off Unit 7, okay? To be honest with you, I do not know where, between 6th period and 7th period, where things landed before spring break. It's all kind of a blur to me. But I'm pretty certain that in both classes we at least got to the midway point of World War II, and so that is what I am going to focus on here: is the turning of the tide. So, in other words, momentum shifting away from the Axis powers, the Germans, the Italians, the Japanese, and the momentum instead flipping over to the Allied side, so the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, the three countries making up the Allies. So start you off there with that in 1942 on the European theater side, and yes, we do use that term theater to it's kind of just military terminology. We mentioned this in class, but it actually starts down in Northern Africa, even though we refer to it as the European theater. I know technically Africa, but and that is a defeat by German forces that were down there, the Germans down there helping Italians who had been trying to kind of establish some victories in North Africa against the British. The Germans jump in to help. Well, by 1942, they are overwhelmed, and by late 1942, the United States even jumps in to help the British in North Africa. So that will be the first part. Probably the biggest part of the other turning point in Europe is going to come with the Battle of Stalingrad that takes place over 1942 and into early 1943. This is Hitler's attempt to, after losing the momentum in his attempt to capture Moscow in 1941, instead is attacking the city that is named after Joseph Stalin, so it's kind of got that name recognition element to it, but also a major factory manufacturing center for the Soviet Union. Hitler commits a large military force to trying to capture Stalingrad, and through a course of, well, for Hitler and the Germans, for a course of kind of a misfortunate events, the German army who is trying to undertake this attack ends up being surrounded by the Soviet Union. When it's all said and done, the Germans lose about 1 million troops, both killed, wounded, and taken prisoner. And Stalingrad is, excuse me, is a defeat for the Germans that they're never going to fully recover from. Just the loss of nearly 1 million soldiers in itself that the Germans are not going to be able to replace. And so you kind of put that together, and that is going to start to shift the momentum over to the Allied side in Europe. If we flip over to Asia and the Pacific, remember the attack on Pearl Harbor is in December of 1941. It does not take long for the Allies, mainly the United States, because although we're going to have some help from the British and from Australia, a lot of the fighting in the Pacific is going to be kind of mainly handled by the United States. And we start to see the beginning of the turning of things in as early as May. So just about like 6 months after Pearl Harbor, battle that takes place in the South Pacific, Coral Sea, where the United States doesn't necessarily score a major victory, but is able to halt the continued expansion of the Japanese military. Remember, the Japanese had been pushing outward, Pearl Harbor being just part of a whole bunch of coordinated attacks. So at the Battle of the Coral Sea, we're able to stop them. It's like it represents the furthest reach the Japanese are ever going to have. And then the following month, another battle takes place, this one in Midway Island, up north of Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands. And this is going to be a battle that takes place over several days, mainly a sea battle, just like Coral Sea. It's going to be battles mainly being fought by aircraft carriers, and the planes being launched from them, attacking enemy aircraft, that kind of thing. And at the Battle of Midway, what we are able to accomplish is basically kind of breaking the back, so to speak, of the Japanese Navy. We end up sinking three or four Japanese aircraft carriers in this battle. It's going to be kind of like we talked about with Stalingrad. It's going to be a battle that the Japanese are never going to be able to fully recover from. They're not able to build the ships to replace those that they lost, and so this is going to start them on the road towards starting to lose control of the war. And so, kind of where Stalingrad is seen as the turning point in the European theater, the Battle of Midway is usually seen as the turning point in the fighting in the Pacific theater. Okay, followed up very quickly by invasion of island in the South Pacific called Guadalcanal. This is kind of the beginning of what's going to be known as kind of this island hopping strategy that the United States is going to use, where we one by one are taking these islands back that the Japanese had captured in the early months of the war, and a lot of hard fighting that takes place involved in all of that. The down there D, the advantages that we have, well, basically that while Japanese industries are going to begin to start to struggle after 1942, the war effort not necessarily going Japan's way, access to natural resources not getting what they need. Meanwhile, the United States is going in the opposite direction. We are beginning to pump out more airplanes, more tanks, more ships. And we're going to have growing over 1943, 44, and into 45. We're going to have this growing advantage over the Japanese in terms of our naval forces, our military forces, our air forces, all of it to slowly but surely begin to overwhelm Japan. Okay, all right. Last years of World War II. By the time we get to 1943, whether we're looking at both the Pacific or Europe, we are looking at this overall picture of the Allies pretty much having control and the Axis playing this defensive side, where they are slowly but surely beginning to lose control over their aspects of the war. Let's see here. By 1943, we've launched an invasion of Italy, the United States, and the British, and it's not going to be too long after that the Italian people are going to rise up and throw Mussolini out of power. Hitler will attempt to return Mussolini back to power, being pretty much propped up by German forces, but we'll get to that. That'll fall apart. By 1944, the United States, Canada, and Great Britain will launch a major attack against Germany and France. We'll invade the Normandy part of France in early June of 1944. An attack come to be known as D-Day. Those of you who've seen Saving Private Ryan, that's kind of what is depicted in the opening scenes of that movie. A massive, what we call amphibious invasion, where we attack from the sea and gain a foothold into Europe. And that will start the process then of beginning to move German troops out of France and start liberating basically liberating, freeing Western Europe. At the same time, the Soviet Union back over in Russia and the Soviet Union, they are also gaining hold of situation. Again, Stalingrad was the beginning of the end for the German dominance that they had in the Soviet Union. And by the time we get into 1943 and 1944, the Russians, the Soviets themselves, are now pushing the Germans across the Soviet Union and steadily pretty much all the way out of the country. And so they now have full control over what's going on. Basically, Germany is going to be feeling itself being squeezed by three directions. From the east by the Soviet Union, from the west by the United States and Great Britain, and then from the south by the United States and Great Britain. Kind of the three-way squeeze there. Toward the very, very end of 1944, Hitler will try one last gamble in the West. He'll kind of cobble together as much of his forces as he can and launch an offensive against U.S. forces in Belgium. Comes to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, because it kind of, for temporarily at least, kind of pounds a little bit of a bulge into the lines between U.S. and German forces. But ultimately, it is a failed attack. and really the last major attack the Germans are going to be able to try to pull off. They just cannot pierce the kind of advantages that the Allies have in terms of soldiers, just sheer numbers, and the material that we have, whether it comes to our tanks, our aircraft, all that sort of thing. While that is going on, talking about aircraft, while that is all going on, this fighting on the ground, the liberation of Western Europe, and then the Soviet Union pushing German forces out of their country, we also have a massive bombing campaign that is going on against Germany. Basically, us and the British, their Royal Air Force, we are bombing Germany day and night. We pretty much set it up so that the British bomb at night, we bomb during the day, and first target military cities and sites in Germany, major industrial centers and that sort of thing. Before the war ends, we've moved on to doing what is euphemistically called terror bombing. And that is basically bombing German civilian centers, cities and locations that don't have any military significance, but trying to bomb the Germans into just surrendering, thinking that if we drop enough bombs that we're going to break their will to keep fighting, and they're going to rise up against maybe the Nazi leadership. Something will break, something will give. The reality is that, again, we're going to get another example that bombing alone cannot do it, cannot win a war. And even though we are going to drop, us and the British are going to drop tons and tons of bombs on Germany and kill hundreds of thousands of people, both military personnel, but also civilians, it's not going to quicken up the pace of ending the war really at all. Okay, we'll get a little bit more into that when we talk about atrocities. So the end is going to come in Europe in 1945, in the spring of 1945. Hold on here just a sec. My apologies. Minor dog revolt. It's under control. But spring of 1945, first of all, the death of Benito Mussolini. Again, like I said, Hitler, when the Italian people threw him out, Hitler tries to kind of return him back to power. In the end, Mussolini ends up being captured, basically by Italian resistance fighters, and they execute him. They just put him up against a wall and they kill him, and then they put his body on public display. People abuse it. They beat it with sticks, and this all ends up being kind of featured in newsreels and pictures. And Hitler he sees it. He knows what happens, and he is determined that he is not going to meet that same kind of an end. By the time you get into April of 1945, Berlin itself, the capital of Nazi Germany, is under attack by the Soviet Union. They are into the city itself. They've pushed the Germans all the way out of their country, all the way across Poland and into Germany. And in the final days of April, Hitler ends up underground in a bunker in the middle of downtown Berlin, under all the main government buildings there in the capital. And when he realizes that there's no way out and the end is imminent, he commits suicide. And about a week later, the German the leaders, surviving military leaders, finally ask for surrender. On May 8th, that becomes well, not official, but I mean the shooting part of it comes to an end, and surrender terms are agreed upon. What comes to be known as VED, Victory in Europe Day. All right, and so that ends that part of the war. But there is still fighting to be had over in the Pacific. 1945 is going to be all about the United States trying to capture islands close enough to Japan to where we can start flying bombers regularly over Japan, and trying to do what didn't work in Germany, and that is drop enough bombs on Japan to try to get them to surrender. Two major islands, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, give us an indicator of the kind of attack or the kind of war we're truly up against. we already knew this, that fighting against, this island hopping that we had been doing, going all the way back to Guadalcanal and every other island we had to capture, that Japanese warrior code, kind of that Bushido that we talked about in prior units, it still exists. And the Japanese soldiers, they don't surrender. They fight to the death. To them, surrendering is like the ultimate dishonor. It dishonors them, their families, their dead ancestors. And so by and large, it is very rare for Japanese soldiers to intentionally surrender. Instead, they fight until there's no option left. They fight until they're dead. And this makes for a very costly way of fighting a war. When you are fighting against an enemy that refuses to surrender, are going to try to take out as many of the enemy as they can before they ultimately die. It just means the casualty rate is going to be just all the more higher. This doesn't happen in Europe. German soldiers, when they're surrounded, when they know they're beat, they hands up, they give up, they surrender. That is not happening in the Pacific. And we see just horrible examples of this in our battles for these two islands. We win in the end in both of them, but at incredibly high cost in American lives. We also see by 1945 that the Japanese, out of desperation, are beginning to fly airplanes, what they call kamikaze, the divine wind, and into our ships. Basically turning aircraft into, basically they're like suicide bombers, where Japanese pilots will intentionally fly these planes that are, loaded down with explosives, knowing that they're not coming back, and flying their planes into our aircraft carriers, into our destroyers or battleships, sacrificing themselves to try to destroy, what they see as this enemy that is now threatening the Japanese home islands themselves. Okay, but like I said, we continue to make progress, and pretty soon we do. We have air bases on these islands that we are able to start flying our bombers over the skies of Japan, bombing Tokyo, Yokohama, other major cities. Some of them are military targets, some of them not so. And again, just trying to, the same strategy in Germany, trying to bomb and drop enough bombs to where we break the will of the Japanese people to keep fighting. An example of that would be the firebombing of Tokyo. The majority of buildings in the city of Tokyo are made of wood. And in a series of bombing raids in 1945, over 100,000 civilians die in these bombing raids. And the Japanese government just seems indifferent to it. They just absolutely, we will not surrender. Okay. It is at that point that, the United States begins to plan for an invasion of Japan. Our president at that time is Harry Truman. Franklin Roosevelt, our president, had been reelected for a fourth term as president in 1944, but in February of 1945, he died of a stroke. And so when our new president was brought on board, Harry Truman, he was going to be a guy that was going to be given a huge choice to make. Our U.S. military had worked up estimates as to what it would take for us to invade the Japanese home islands. And they expected that the United States could potentially lose between, let me see if I can remember these numbers here, if I can remember how this works. They were estimating that we could lose between about 2 to 4 million American soldiers killed and wounded if we tried to invade the Japanese islands. We knew that the Japanese people were being trained to basically sacrifice themselves in case their islands were attacked. And so we were going to be fighting against an enemy that would refuse to surrender even in their own country, especially in their own country, and we're going to do everything in their power to kill as many of us as possible. And so, President Truman was told this is going to cost between 2 and 4 million Americans killed and wounded. And on top of that, they estimated that it would probably cost somewhere around the area of 5 to 10 million Japanese lives as well. Because again, they're not going to surrender. They're going to kill themselves. It's going to be suicide on a mass scale by the Japanese people. All right. Truman is also told that there has been a secret program that has been operating in the United States for the last several years to develop a new kind of a weapon, a new kind of bomb. And the bomb had been tested in the late spring, early summer of 1945. The tests had been successful, and Truman was told, we have this bomb at our disposal. We can use it and see if that will work to end the war. But ultimately, it was going to be Truman's choice. Do we invade like we did in Europe, or do we try with these bombs? I'm not going to I'll let you decide. I'm not going to tell you right, wrong, or anything else. Truman, later on, when he wrote about it, pretty much said, the prospect of up to 4 million American casualties. He just said, I didn't even have to think hard about it. I told him, go ahead, drop the bombs. And so in early August of 1945, the United States drops a bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. That bomb kills about 40 to 50,000 people. We expect that the Japanese government will surrender. They don't, and so a couple of days later, we drop a second bomb on another city of Nagasaki. Between these two cities, people who die in the immediate aftermath of the bombings and those who will die later on, you've got the number there. 140,000 overall will end up dying. After the second bomb falls, Nagasaki, then the Japanese government finally accepts that, they don't, at that point, they don't know if we're just going to keep dropping these on them. Reality is we only had 2 bombs available at that time. And so we were playing them a pretty big bluff here that, hopefully they were going to think that we had more of these to drop. But no, we only had the 2. But after the bombing of Nagasaki, the Japanese government finally asked to surrender. And August 14th, the terms were drawn up to do just that, to bring the fighting in Japan, or excuse me, in the Pacific Theater to an end, and that will be that. VJ Day, Victory Over Japan Day, August 14th. Okay, and we'll finish this off by looking at just some stats here, consequences of World War II. And so, we talk about World War I, somewhere kind of estimates vary all over the place, 20 to 30 million. We estimate 75 million dying in World War II. And the real shocking figure there is that idea that 2/3 of those were civilians. Only 1/3 of that 75 million are actual, what we call combatants, soldiers fighting in combat. And so, again, a very, very different kind of war where there was a higher likelihood that a civilian was going to die than an actual person in uniform. Another big consequence of this is basically the balance of power, world power. Is going to be completely upended. Going into World War II, there was still kind of this idea of the old traditional European powers, the British, the French, we could even throw the Germans in there, that those being those traditional powers. Now that's all gone. And you have these 2 new powers. Actually, what this new term of superpowers is now going to be used to describe the United States, who now has this huge role on the world stage, and the Soviet Union. Who is going to be a country who experiences, really, of all the countries of World War II, the Soviet Union, out of that 75 million, almost 30 million of those dead are going to be from the Soviet Union. They are going to suffer far more casualties than any other country, but they're also going to come out of this war as this new massive power. And that is where we'll end World War II, all right? Gets you to a couple of consequences there and everything else that we need to cover. So this will cover you for World War II if you were not in class to get all of this in class. And then I'm going to add one other video here that is going to, again, get us into this topic of mass atrocities during the 20th century. All right, but that'll cover us for World War II. See ya.